The History of Protestantism by James A. Wylie. Volume 2, Book 16, Protestantism in the Waldensian Valleys. Chapter 1, Antiquity and First Persecutions of the Waldenses. The Waldenses stand apart and alone in the Christian world. Their place on the surface of Europe is unique. Their position in history is not less unique, and the end appointed them to fulfill is one which has been assigned to them alone, no other people being permitted to share it with them. The Waldenses bear a twofold testimony. Like the snow-clad peaks amidst which their dwelling is placed, they look down upon the plains of Italy on the one side, and the provinces of France on the other. This people stand equally related to primitive ages and modern times, and give by no means equivocal testimony respecting both Rome and the Reformation. If they are old, then Rome is new. If they are pure, then Rome is corrupt. And if they have retained the faith of the apostles, it follows uncontestably that Rome has departed from it. That the Waldensian faith and worship existed many centuries before Protestantism arose is undeniable. The proofs and monuments of this fact lie scattered over all the histories and all the lands of medieval Europe. But the antiquity of the Waldenses is the antiquity of Protestantism. The Church of the Reformation was in the lions of the Waldensian church ages before the birth of Luther. Her first cradle was placed amid those terrors and sublimities, those ice-clad peaks and great bulwarks of rock. In their dispersions over so many lands, over France, the Low Countries, Germany, Poland, Bohemia, Moravia, England, Calabria, Naples, the Waldenses sowed the seeds of that great spiritual revival which, beginning in the days of Wycliffe and advancing in the times of Luther and Calvin, awaits its full consummation in the ages to come. In the place which the Church of the Alps has held, and the office she has discharged, we see the reason of that peculiar and bitter hostility which Rome has ever borne this holy and venerable community. It was natural that Rome should wish to efface so conclusive a proof of her apostasy, and silence a witness whose testimony so emphatically corroborates the position of Protestantism. The great bulwark of the Reformed Church is the Word of God. But next to this is the pre-existence of a community spread throughout Western Christendom, with doctrines and worship substantially one with those of the Reformation. The persecutions of this remarkable people form one of the most heroic pages of church history. These persecutions, protracted through many centuries, were endured with a patience, constancy, and bravery honorable to the gospel, as well as to those simple people whom the gospel converted into heroes and martyrs. Their resplendent virtues illumined the darkness of their age, and we turn with no little relief from a Christendom sunk in barbarism and superstition to this remnant of an ancient people, who in their mountain-encircled territory practiced the simplicity, the piety, and the heroism of a better age. It is mainly those persecutions of the Waldenses which connect themselves with the Reformation, and which were, in fact, part of the mighty effort made by Rome to extinguish Protestantism, on which we shall dwell. But we must introduce ourselves to the great tragedy by a brief notice of the attacks which led up to it. That part of the great Alpine chain that extends between Turin on the east and Grenoble on the west is known as the Cottian Alps. This is the dwelling place of the Waldenses, the land of ancient Protestantism. On the west, the mountains slope toward the plains of France, and on the east they run down to those of Piedmont. That line of glittering summits, conspicuous among which is the lofty snow-clad peak of Monte Viso on the west, and the craggy escarpments of Genevieve on the east, forms the boundary between the Albigenses and the Waldenses, the two bodies of these early witnesses. On the western slope were the dwellings of the former people, and on the eastern those of the latter. Not entirely so, however, for the Waldenses, crossing the summits, had taken possession of the more elevated portion of the western declivities, and scarcely was there a valley in which their villages and sanctuaries were not to be found. But in the lower valleys, and more particularly in the vast and fertile plains of the Dauphiné and Provence, spread out at the foot of the Alps, the inhabitants were mainly of Alpine or Gallic extraction, and are known in history as the Albigenses. How flourishing they were, how numerous and opulent their towns, how rich their cornfields and vineyards, and how polished the manners and cultured the genius of the people, we have already said. We have also described the terrible expiation innocently extracted of them for their attachment to a purer Christianity than that of Rome. He launched his bull, he sent forth his inquisitors, and soon the fertility and beauty of the region were swept away. City and sanctuary sank in ruins, and the plains so recently covered with smiling fields were converted into a desert. The work of destruction had been done with tolerable completeness on the west of the Alps, and after a short pause it was commenced on the east, it being resolved to pursue these confessors of a pure faith across the mountains, and attack them in those grand valleys which open into Italy, where they lay entrenched, as in a fastness formed of massive chestnut forests and mighty pinnacles of rock. We place ourselves at the foot of the eastern slope, about 30 miles to the west of Turin. Behind us is the vast sweep of the plain of Piedmont. Above us, in front, tower the Alps, here forming a crescent of grand mountains, extending from the escarped summit that leans over Pinerolo on the right to the pyramidal peak of Monte Viso, which cleaves the Ebene like a horn of silver, and marks the furthest limit of the Waldensian territory on the left. In the bosom of that mountain crescent, shaded by its chestnut forests and encircled by its glittering peaks, are hung the famous valleys of that people of whose martyrdom we now begin to narrate. In the center of the picture, right before us, rises the pillar-like Castelluzzo. Behind it is the towering mass of the Vandalin, and in front, as if to bar the way against entrance of any hostile force into this sacred territory, is drawn the long, low hill of Brick-Orazio, feathery with woods, bristling with great rocks, and leaving open, between its rugged mass and the spurs of Monte Friulante on the west, only a narrow avenue, shaded by walnut and acacia trees, which leads up to the point where the valleys, spreading out fan-like, bury themselves in the mountains that open their stony arms to receive them. Historians have enumerated some 30 persecutions enacted on this little spot. One of the earliest dates in the martyr history of this people is 1332, or thereabouts, for the time is not distinctly marked. The reigning pope was John XXII. Desirous of resuming the work of Innocent III, he ordered the inquisitors to repair to the valleys of Lucerna and Perosa to execute the laws of the Vatican against the heretics that peopled them. What success attended the expedition is not known, and we instance it chiefly on this account, that the bull commanding it bears undesigned testimony of the flourishing condition of the Waldensian Church, inasmuch as it complains that synods, which the Pope calls chapters, were used to assemble in the valley of Angrogna, attended by 500 delegates. This was before Wycliffe had begun his career in England. After this date, scarcely was there a pope who did not bear unintentional testimony to their great numbers and wide diffusion. In 1352, we find Pope Clement VI charging the Bishop of Embrun, with whom he associates the Franciscan friar and inquisitor, to essay the purification of those parts adjoining his diocese which were known to be infected with heresy. The territorial lords and city syndics were invited to aid him. While providing for the heretics of the valleys, the Pope did not overlook those farther off. He urged the Dauphin, Charles of France, and Louis, King of Naples, to seek out and punish those of their subjects who had strayed from the faith. Clement referred doubtless to the Vaudois colonies, which are known to have existed in that age at Naples. The fact that the heresy of the Waldensian mountains extended to the plains at their feet is attested by the letter of the Pope to Joanna, wife of the King of Naples, who owned lands in the Marquisate of Saluzzo, near the valleys, urging her to purge her territory of the heretics that lived in it. The zeal of the Pope, however, was but indifferently seconded by that of the secular lords. The men they were enjoined to exterminate were the most industrious and peaceable of their subjects, and willing as they no doubt were to oblige the Pope, they were naturally averse to incur so great a loss as would be caused by the destruction of the flower of their populations. Besides, the princes of that age were often at war among themselves, and had not much leisure or inclination to make war on the Pope's behalf. Therefore the papal thunder sometimes rolled harmlessly over the valleys, and the mountain home of these confessors was wonderfully shielded till very nearly the era of the Reformation. We find Gregory XI in 1373 writing to Charles V of France to complain that his officers thwarted his inquisitors at Dauphine, that the papal judges were not permitted to institute proceedings against those suspected without the consent of the civil judge, and that the disrespect to the spiritual tribunal was sometimes carried so far as to release the condemned heretics from prison. Notwithstanding this leniency, so culpable in the eyes of Rome, on the part of princes and magistrates, the inquisitors were able to make more than a few victims. These acts of violence provoked reprisals at times on the part of the Waldenses. On one occasion, 1375, the Popish city of Susa was attacked, the Dominican convent forced, and the inquisitor put to death. Other Dominicans were called to expiate their rigor against the Vaudois with the penalty of their lives. An obnoxious inquisitor of Turin is said to have been slain on the highway near Bricasario. There came evil days to the popes themselves. First they were chased to Avignon, next the yet greater calamity of the schism befell them, but their own afflictions had not the effect of softening their hearts toward the confessors of the Alps. During the clouded era of their captivity and the tempestuous days of the schism, they pursued with the same inflexible rigor their policy of extermination. They were ever and anon fulminating their persecuting edicts, and their inquisitors were scouring the valleys in pursuit of victims. An inquisitor of the name of Borelli had 150 Vaudois men, besides a great number of women, girls, and even young children, brought to Grenoble and burned alive. The closing days of the year 1400 witnessed a terrible tragedy, the memory of which has not been obliterated by the many greater which have followed it. The scene of this catastrophe was the valley of Pregalas, one of the higher reaches of the Perosa, which opens near Pinerolo and is watered by the Clusone. It was the Christmas of 1400. and the inhabitants dreaded no attack, believing themselves sufficiently protected by the snows which then lay deep on their mountains. They were destined to experience the bitter fact that the rigors of the season had not quenched the fire of their persecutors' malice. The man named above, Borelli, at the head of an armed troop, broke suddenly into Pergolas, meditating the entire extinction of its population. The miserable inhabitants fled in haste to the mountains, carrying on their shoulders their old men, their sick, and their infants, knowing what fate awaited them should they leave them behind. In their flight, a great many were overtaken and slain. Nightfall brought them deliverance from the pursuit, but no deliverance from the horrors not less dreadful. The main body of the fugitives wandered in the direction of Maysel, in the storm-swept and ice-clad valley of San Martino, where they encamped on a summit which has ever since, in memory of the event, borne the name of the albergue or refuge. Without shelter, without food, the frozen snow around them, the winter sky overhead, their sufferings were inexpressibly great. When morning broke, what a heart-rending spectacle did the day disclose! Of the miserable group, the hands and feet of many were frozen, while others were stretched out in the snows, stiffened corpses. 50 young children, some say 80, were found dead with cold, some lying on the bare ice, others locked in the frozen arms of their mothers, who had perished on that dreadful night along with their babies. In the valley of Pergolas, to this day, sire recites to son the tale of that Christmas tragedy. The century, the opening of which had been so fearfully marked, passed on amid continuous executions of the Waldenses. In the absence of such catastrophes as that of Christmas 1400, individual Vaudois were kidnapped by the inquisitors, ever on the track for them, or waylaid whenever they ventured down into the plain of Piedmont, were carried to Turin and other towns, and burned alive. But Rome saw that she was making no progress in the extermination of a heresy which had found a seat amid these hills, as firm as it was ancient. The number of the Waldenses were not thinned. Their constancy was not shaken. They still refused to enter the Roman Church, and they met all the edicts and inquisitors, all the torturing and burning of their great persecutor, with a resistance as unyielding as that which their rocks offer to the tempests of hail and snow, which the whirlwinds of winter hurl against them. It was the year 1487. A great blow was meditated. The process of purging the valleys languished. Pope Innocent VIII, who then filled the papal chair, remembered how his renowned namesake, Innocent III, by an act of summary vengeance, had swept the Albigensian heresy from the south of France. Imitating the vigor of his predecessor, he would purge the valleys as effectually and as speedily as Innocent III had done the plains of Dauphine and Provence. The first step of the Pope was to issue a bull, denouncing as heretical those whom he had delivered over to slaughter. This bull, after the manner of all such documents, was expressed in terms as sanctimonious as its spirit was inexorably cruel. It brings no charge against these men as lawless, idle, dishonest, or disorderly. Their fault was that they did not worship as Innocent worshipped, and that they practiced a simulated sanctity, which had the effect of seducing the sheep of the true fold. Therefore, he orders that malicious and abominable sect of malignants, if they refuse to abjure, to be crushed like venomous snakes. To carry out this bull, Innocent VIII appointed Albert Cataneo, Archdeacon of Cremona, his legate, devolving upon him the chief conduct of the enterprise. He fortified him, moreover, with papal missives to all princes, dukes, and powers within whose dominions any Vaudois were to be found. The popes especially accredited him to Charles VIII of France and Charles II of Savoy, commanding them to support him with the whole power of their arms. The bull invited all Catholics to take up the cross against the heretics, and to stimulate them in this pious work. It absolved from all ecclesiastical pains and penalties, general and particular. It released all who joined the crusade from any oaths they might have taken. It legitimized their title to any property they might have illegally acquired, and promised remission of all their sins to such as should kill any heretic. It annulled all the contracts made in favor of the Vaudois, ordered their domestics to abandon them, forbade all persons to give them any aid whatever, and empowered all persons to take possession of their property. These were powerful incentives: plenary pardon and unrestrained license. They were hardly needed to awaken the zeal of the neighboring populations, always too ready to show their devotion to Rome by spilling the blood and harrying the land and goods of the Waldenses. The King of France and the Duke of Savoy lent a willing ear to the summons from the Vatican. They made haste to unfurl their banners and enlist soldiers in this holy cause. And soon a numerous army was on its march to sweep from the mountains where they had dwelt from immemorial time these confessors of the gospel faith, pure and undefiled. In the train of this armed host came a motley crowd of volunteers, vagabond adventurers, says Muston, ambitious fanatics, reckless pillagers, merciless assassins, assembled from all parts of Italy. A horde of brigands, in short, the worthy tools of the man whose bloody work they were assembled to do. Before all these arrangements were finished, it was the June of 1488. The Pope's bull was talked of in all countries, and the din of preparation rung far and near, for it was not only on the Waldensian mountains, but on the Waldensian race, wherever dispersed, in Germany, Calabria, and in other countries, that this terrible blow was to fall. All kings were invited to gird on the sword and come to the help of the Church in the execution of so total and complete an extermination of her enemies as should ever need to be repeated. Wherever a Vaudois foot tread, the soil was polluted and had to be cleansed. Wherever a Vaudois breathed, the air was tainted and must be purified. Wherever Vaudois' psalm or prayer ascended, there was the infection of heresy, and around the spot a cordon must be drawn to protect the spiritual health of the district. The Pope's bull was thus very universal in its application, and almost the only people left ignorant of the commotion it had excited and the bustle of preparation it had called forth were those poor men on whom this terrible tempest was about to burst. The joint army numbered about 18,000 regular soldiers. This force was swelled by the thousands of ruffians already mentioned, drawn together by the spiritual and temporal rewards to be earned in this work of combined piety and pillage. The Piedmont division of this host directed their course toward the valleys proper on the Italian side of the Alps. The French division, marching from the north, advanced to attack the inhabitants of the Dauphine Alps, where the Albigensian heresy, recovering somewhat its terrible excision by Innocent III, had begun again to take root. Two storms from opposite points, or rather from all points, were approaching those mighty mountains, the sanctuary and citadel of the primitive faith. That lamp is about to be extinguished at last, which has burned here so many ages and survived so many tempests. The mailed hand of the Pope is uplifted, and we wait to see the fatal blow.
You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com worldwide. Freedom is never free. We need your support today at FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on satellite, internet, or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
The History of Protestantism by James A. Wylie. Volume 2, Book 16, Protestantism in the Waldensian Valleys. Chapter 2, Catanale's Expedition against the Dauphin and Piedmont Confessors, 1488. We see at this moment two armies on the march to attack the Christians inhabiting the Cottian and Dauphin Alps. The sword, now unsheathed, is to be returned to its scabbard only when there breathes no longer in these mountains a single confessor of the faith, condemned in the bull of Innocent VIII. The plan of the campaign was to attack at the same time on two opposite points of the great mountain chain, and advancing, one army from the southeast and the other from the northwest, to meet in the valley of Angrogna, the center of the territory, and there strike the final blow. Let us attend first to the French division of this host, and what is advancing from the north against the Alps of Dauphin. This portion of the Crusaders was led by a daring and cruel man, skilled in adventures, the Lord of La Palla. He ascended the mountains with his fanatics, and entered the Vale of Lois, a deep gorge overhung by towering mountains. The inhabitants, seeing an armed force, 20 times their own number, enter their valley, despaired of being able to resist them, and prepared for flight. They placed their old people and children in rustic carts, together with their domestic utensils, and such store of victuals as the urgency of the occasion permitted them to collect. And driving their herds before them, they began to climb the rugged slopes of Mount Pelvoux, which rises some 600 feet over the level of the valley. They sang canticles as they climbed the steeps, which served at once to smooth their rugged path and to dispel their terrors. Not a few were overtaken and slaughtered, and theirs was perhaps the happier lot. About halfway up, there's an immense cavern, called a Jouffroid, from the cold springs that gush out of its rocky walls. In front of the cavern is a platform of rock, where the spectator sees beneath him only fearful precipice, which must be clambered over before one can reach the entrance of the grotto. The roof of the cave forms a magnificent arch, which gradually subsides and contracts into a narrow passage, or throat, and then widens once more and forms a roomy hall of irregular form. Into this grotto, as into an impregnable castle, the Vaudois entered. Their women, infants, and old men they placed in the inner hall. Their cattle and sheep they distributed along the lateral cavities of the grotto. The able-bodied men posted themselves at the entrance, having barricaded with huge stones both the doorway of the cave and the path that led to it. They deemed themselves secure. They had provisions to last, Cataneo says in his memoirs, 2 years, and it would cost them little effort to hurl headlong down the precipice anyone who should attempt to scale them in order to reach the entrance of the cavern. But a device of their pursuer rendered all these precautions and defenses vain. La Palud ascended the mountain on the other side, and approaching the cave from above, let down his soldiers by ropes from the precipice that overhangs the entrance of the grotto. The platform in front was thus secured by his soldiers. The Vaudois might have cut the ropes and dispatched their foes as they were being lowered one by one, but the boldness of the maneuver would seem to have paralyzed them. They retreated into the cavern to find in it their grave. La Palud saw the danger of permitting his men to follow them into the depths of their hiding place. He adopted the easier and safer method of piling up at its entrance all the wood he could collect and setting fire to it. The huge volume of black smoke began to roll into the cave, leaving to the unhappy inmates the miserable alternative of rushing out and falling by the sword that waited for them, or of remaining in the interior to be stifled by the murky vapor. Some rushed out and were massacred, but the greater part remained till death slowly approached them by suffocation. When the cavern was afterwards examined, says Mouston, there were found in it 400 infants, suffocated in their cradles, or in the arms of their dead mothers. Altogether there perished in this cavern more than 3,000 Vaudois, including the entire population of Valois. Cataneo distributed the property of these unfortunates among the vagabonds who accompanied him, and never again did the Vaudois church raise its head in these blood-stained valleys. The terrible stroke that fell on the Vale of Lois was the shielding of the neighboring valleys of Argentière and Fraisenet. Their inhabitants had been destined to destruction also, but the fate of their co-religionists taught them that their only chance of safety lay in resistance. Accordingly, barricading the passes of their valleys, they showed such affront to the foe when he advanced that he deemed it prudent to turn away and leave them in peace. This devastating tempest now sweeping along to discharge its violence on other valleys. One would have thought, to use the words of Mouston, that the plague had passed along the track over which its march lay. It was only the Inquisitors. A detachment of the French army struck across the Alps in a southeast direction, holding their course toward the Waldensian valleys, there to unite with the main body of the Crusaders under Cataneo. They slaughtered, pillaged, and burned as they went onward, and at last arrived with dripping swords in the valley of Pergolesi. The valley of Pergolesi, where we now see these assassins, sweeps along from almost the summit of the Alps to the south, watered by the rivers Clusone and Dora, and opens on the great plain of Piedmont, having Pinerolo on the one side and Susa on the other. It was then and long after under the dominion of France, prior to the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, says Mouston. The Vaudois of the valley, that is Pergolesi, and the lateral vales branching out from it, possessed 11 parishes, 18 churches, and 64 centers of religious assembling, where worship was celebrated morning and evening in as many hamlets. It was in Laos, in Pergolus, that was held the famous synod, where, 200 years before the Protestant Reformation, 140 Protestant pastors assembled, each accompanied by 2 or 3 lay deputies, and it was from the Val de Pergolus that the gospel of God made its way into France prior to the 15th century. This was the Valley of Pergolus, which had been the scene of the terrible tragedy of Christmas 1400. Again, terror, mourning, and death were carried into it. The peaceful inhabitants, who were expecting no such invasion, were busy reaping their harvests when this horde of assassins burst upon it. In the first panic, they abandoned their dwellings and fled. Many were overtaken and slain. Hamlets and whole villages were given to the flames. Nor could the caves in which the multitude sought refuge afford any protection. The horrible barbarity of the Valois was repeated in the Valley of Pergolus. Combustible materials were piled up and fires kindled at the mouths of these hiding places, and when extinguished, all was silent. Folded together in one motionless heap lay mother and babe, patriarch and stripling, while the fatal smoke, which had cast them into that deep sleep, was eddying along the roof and slowly making its exit into the clear, sunlit summer sky. But the course of this destruction was stayed. After the first surprise, the inhabitants took heart, and turning upon their murderers, drove them from their valley, extracting a heavy penalty in the pursuit for the ravages they had committed in it. We now turn to the Piedmont portion of this army. It was led by the papal legate, Cataneo, in person. It was destined to operate against those valleys in Piedmont which were the most ancient seat of these religionists, and were deemed the stronghold of the Vaudois heresy. Cataneo repaired to Pinerolo, which adjoins the frontier of the doomed territory. Thence he dispatched his band of preaching monks to convert the men of the valleys. These missionaries returned without having, so far as appears, made a single convert. The legate now put his soldiers in motion, traversing the glorious plain, the Clusone gleaming out through rich cornfields and vineyards on their left, and the mighty rampart of the hills with their chestnut forests, their pastures and snows rising grandly on their right, and turning round the shoulder of the copse-clad Bricaracio, this army, with another army of pillagers and cutthroats in its rear, advanced up the long avenue that leads to La Tour, the capital of the valleys, and sat down before it. They had come against a simple, unarmed people, who knew to tend their vines and lead their herds to pasture, but were ignorant of the art of war. It seems as if the last hour of the Waldensian race had struck. Seeing this mighty host before their valleys, the Waldenses sent 2 of their patriarchs to request an interview with Cataneo, and turn, if possible, his heart to peace. John Campo and John Desiderio were dispatched on this embassy. "Do not condemn us without hearing us," said they, "for we are Christians and faithful subjects, and our barbs are prepared to prove, in public or in private, that our doctrines are conformable to the Word of God. Our hope in God is greater than our desire to please men. Beware how you draw down yourselves his anger by persecuting us, for remember that, if God so wills it, all the forces you have assembled against us will nothing avail." These were weighty words, and they were meekly spoken. But as to changing Cataneo's purpose, or softening the hearts of the ruffian hosts which he led, They might as well have been addressed to the rocks which rose around the speakers. Nevertheless, they fell not to the ground. Cat and Ale, believing the Vaudois herdsman would not stand an hour before his men-at-arms, and desirous of striking a finishing blow, divided his army into a number of attacking parties, which were to begin the battle on various points at the same time. The folly of extending his line so as to embrace the whole territory led to Cat and Ale's destruction, but his strategy was rewarded with a few small successes at first. One troop was stationed at the entrance of the Val Lucerna. We shall follow its march till it disappears on the mountains it hopes to conquer, and then we shall return and narrate the more decisive operations of the campaign under Cantaneo in the Val Angrogna. The first step of the invaders was to occupy the town of La Torre, situated on the angle formed by the junction of the Val Lucerna and the Val Angrogna, the silver Pellis at its feet and the shadow of the Castelluzzo covering it. The soldiers were probably spared the necessity or denied the pleasure of slaughter, the inhabitants having fled to the mountains. The valley beyond La Torre is too open to admit of being defended, and the troop advanced along it unopposed. Than this theater of war, nothing in ordinary times is more peaceful, nothing more grand. A carpet of rich meadows clothes it from side to side. Fruitful trees fleck it with their shadows. The Pellis waters it, and on either hand is a wall of mountains, whose sides display successive zones of festooned vines, golden grain, dark chestnut forests, and rich pastures. Over these are hung stupendous battlements of rock, and above all, towering high in the air, are the everlasting peaks in their robes of ice and snow. But the sublimities of nature were nothing to men whose thoughts were only of blood. Pursuing their march up the valley, the soldiers next came to Villaro. It is situated about midway between the entrance and the head of Lucerna, on a ledge of turf in the side of the great mountains, raised some 200 feet above the Pellis, which flows past at about a quarter-mile's distance. The troop had little difficulty in taking possession. Most of the inhabitants, warned of the approach of danger, had fled to the Alps. What Cataneo's troop inflicted upon those who had been able to make their escape, no history records. The half of Lucerna, with the towns of La Torre and Villaro and their hamlets, was in the occupation of Cataneo's soldiers. Their march so far had been a victorious one, though certainly not a glorious one, such victories as they had gained being only over unarmed peasants and bed-rid women. Resuming their march, the troop came next to Bobbio. The name of Bobbio is not unknown in classic story. It nestles at the base of gigantic cliffs, where the lofty summit of the Col la Croix points the way to France, and overhangs a path which apostolic feet may have trodden. The Pellis is seen forcing its way through the dark gorges of the mountains in a thundering torrent, and meandering in a flood of silver along the valley. At this point, the grandeur of the Val Lucerna attains its height. Let us pause to survey the scene that must here have met the eyes of Cataneo's soldiers, and which, one would suppose, might have turned them from their cruel purpose. Immediately behind, Bobbio shoots up the massive Berrien, symmetrical as an Egyptian obelisk, but far taller. Its summit rises 3,000 feet above the little town. Compared with this majestic monolith, the proudest monument of Europe's proudest capital is a mere toy. Yet even the Berrien is but a detail in the assemblage of glories. Rising behind and sweeping round the extremity of the valley is a glorious amphitheater of crags and precipice enclosed by a background of great mountains, some rounded like domes, others sharp as needles, and rising out of the sea of hills are the grander and loftier forms of the Alpe de Possé and the Côte de Malheur, which guard the gloomy pass that winds its way through splintered rocks and under overhanging sheer drops, till it opens into the valleys of the French Protestants, and lands the traveler on the plains of Dauphine. In this unrivaled amphitheater sits Bobbio, in summer buried in blossoms and fruit, and in winter wrapped in the shadows of its great mountains and the mists of their tempests. What a contrast between the still repose and the grand sublimity of nature and the dreadful errand on which the men now pressing forward to the little town are bent. To them nature speaks in vain. They are engrossed with but one thought, the capture of Bobbio. An easy task put the soldiers in possession of the entire valley of Lucerna. Its inhabitants had been chased to the Alps, or their blood mingled with the waters of their own Pellis. Other and more remote expeditions were now projected. Their plan was to traverse the Col Julien, sweep down on the valley of Prely, which lies on the north of it, chastise its inhabitants, pass on to the valleys of San Martino and Perosa, and pursuing the circuit of the valleys, and clearing up the ground as they went onward of its inveterate heresy, at least of its heretics, join the main body of crusaders who, they expected, would by this time have finished their work in the valley of Angrogna, and unitedly celebrate their victory. They would then be able to say that they had gone the round of the Waldensian territory, and had at last effected the long-meditated work, so often attempted, but hitherto in vain, of the utter extirpation of its heresy. But the war was destined to have a very different termination. The expedition across the Col Julien was immediately commenced. A corps of 700 men was detached from the army in Lucerna for this service. The ascent of the mountain opens immediately on the north side of Bobbio. We see the soldiers toiling upwards on the track, which is a mere footpath formed by the herdsmen. At every short distance they pass the thick, planted chalets and hamlets sweetly embowered amid mantling vines, or the branches of the apple and cherry tree, or of the goodlier chestnut. But the inhabitants have fled. They have now reached a great height on the mountain side. Beneath is Bobbio, a speck of brown. There is the valley of Lucerna, a ribbon of green, with a thread of silver woven into it, and lying along amid masses of mighty rocks. There across the Lucerna are the great mountains that enclose the valley of Rora. Standing up in the silent sky on the right are the spiky crags that bristle along the pass of Mirabeau, which leads to France, and yonder in the east a glimpse of the far-extending plains of Piedmont. But the summit is yet a long way off, and the soldiers of the papal legate, bearing their weapons, to be employed not in venturesome battle, but in cowardly massacre, toil up the ascent. As they gain on the mountain, they look down on pinnacles which half an hour before had looked down on them. Other heights, tall as the former, still rise above them. They climb to these airy spires, which in their turn sink beneath their feet. This process they repeat again and again, and at last they come out upon the downs that clothe the shoulders of the mountains. Now it is that the scene around them becomes one of stupendous, inexpressible grandeur. Away to the east, now fully under the eye, is the plain of Piedmont, green as a garden, and level as the ocean. At their feet yawn gorges and abysses, while spiky pinnacles peer up from below as if to buttress the mountain. The horizon is filled with the Alps, conspicuous among which, on the east, is the Col la Vechera, whose snow-clad summit draws the eye to the more than classic valley over which it towers, where the barbs in ancient days were wont to assemble in synod, and whence their missionaries went forth, at the peril of life, to distribute the Scriptures and sow the seed of the kingdom. It was not unmarked, doubtless, by this core, forming as they meant it should do, the terminating point of their expedition in the Val de Agrogna. On the west, the crowning glory of the scene was Monte Viso, standing up in bold relief in the ebon vault, in a robe of silver. But not in vain had nature spread out her magnificence before them, who had neither eyes to see nor hearts to feel her glory. Climbing on their hands and knees the steep grassy slopes in which the pass terminates, they looked down from the summit on the valley of Prairly. At that moment, a scene of peace. Its great snow-clad hills, conspicuous of which is the Col des Arbres, kept guard round it. Down their sides rolled foaming torrents, which, uniting in the valley, flowed along in a full and rapid river. Over the bosom of the plain were scattered numerous hamlets. The peasants were at work in the meadows and cornfields. Their children were at play. Their herds were browsing in their pastures. Suddenly on the mountains above had gathered this flock of vultures that with greedy eyes were looking down upon their prey. A few hours, and these dwellings would be in flames, their inmates slaughtered, and their herds and goods carried off as booty. Impatient to begin their work, these 700 assassins rushed down on the plain. The troop had reckoned that, no tidings of their approach having reached this secluded valley, they would fall upon its unarmed peasants as falls the avalanche, and crush them. But it was not to be so. Instead of fleeing, panic struck, as the invaders expected, the men of Prairly hastily assembled and stood to their defense. Battle was joined at the hamlet of Pommiers. The weapons of the Vaudois were rude, but their trust in God and their indignation at the cowardly and bloody assault gave them strength and courage. The Piedmont soldiers, wearied with the rugged, slippery tracks they had traversed, fell beneath the blows of their opponents. Every man of them was cut down, with the exception of one ensign. Of all the 700, he alone survived. During the carnage, he made his escape and ascended the banks of a mountain torrent. He crept into a cavity which the summer heats had formed in a mass of snow. There he remained hid for some days. At last, cold and hunger drove him forth to cast himself upon the mercy of the men of Prairly. They were generous enough to pardon this solitary survivor of the host that had come to massacre them. They sent him back across the Col Julien to tell those from whom he had come that the Vaudois had courage to fight for their hearths and altars, and that of the army of 700 which had been sent to slay them, he only had escaped to carry tidings of the fate which had befallen his companions.
The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
The History of Protestantism by James A. Wylie. Volume 2, Book 16, Protestantism in the Waldensian Valleys. Chapter 3. Failure of Catanale's Expedition. The camp of Catanale was pitched almost at the gate of La Torre, beneath the shadow of the Castelluso. The papal legate is about to try to force his way into the Val di Angrogna. This valley opens hard by the spot where the legate had established his camp, and runs on for 12 miles into the Alps, a magnificent succession of narrow gorges and open dells, walled throughout by majestic mountains, and terminating in a noble circular basin, the Pra del Tor, which is set round with snowy peaks, and forms the most venerated spot in all the Waldensian territory, inasmuch as it was the seat of their college and the meeting place of their barbs. In the Pra del Tor, the meadow of the tower, Catanale expected to surprise the mass of the Waldensian people, now gathered into it as being the strongest refuge which their hills afforded. There, too, he expected to be joined by the corps which he had sent round by Lucerna to make the circuit of the valleys, and after devastating Praeli and San Martino to climb the mountain barrier and join their companions in the Pra, little imagining that the soldiers he had dispatched on that errand of massacre were now enriching with their corpses the valleys they had been sent to subdue. In that same spot where the barbs had so often met in synod, and enacted rules for the government of their church and the spread of their faith, the papal legate would reunite his victorious host, and finish the campaign by proclaiming that now the Waldensian heresy, root and branch, was extinct. The Waldenses, their humble supplication for peace, having been contemptuously rejected, as we have already said, had 3 courses in their choice: to go to Mass, to be butchered as sheep, or to fight for their lives. They chose the last and made ready for battle. But first they must remove to a place of safety all who were unable to bear arms, packing up their kneading troughs, their ovens, and other culinary utensils, laying their aged on their shoulders, and their sick in couches, and leading their children by the hand, they began to climb the hills in the direction of the Pra del Tor, at the head of the Val di Angrogna. Transporting their household stuff, they could be seen traversing the rugged paths and making the mountains resound with psalms, which they sweetly sung as they journeyed up the ascent. Those who remained busied themselves in manufacturing pikes and other weapons of defense and attack, in repairing the barricades, in arranging themselves into fighting parties, and assigning to the various corps the posts they were to defend. Catanale now put his soldiers in motion. Advancing to near the town of La Torre, they made a sharp turn to the right and entered the Val di Angrogna. Its opening offers no obstruction, being soft and even as any meadow in all England. By and by it begins to swell into the heights of the Roccomanot, where the Vaudois had resolved to make a stand. Their fighting men were posted along its ridge. Their armor was of the simplest. The bow was almost their only weapon of attack. They wore bucklers of skin, covered with the bark of the chestnut tree, the better to resist thrust of pike or cut of sword. In the hollow behind, protected by the rising ground on which their fathers, husbands, and brothers were posted, were a number of women and children, gathered there for shelter. The Piedmont host pressed up the acclivity, discharging a shower of arrows as they advanced, and the Waldensian line on which these missiles fell seemed to waver, and to be on the point of giving way. Those behind, espying the danger, fell on their knees, and, extending their hands in supplication to the God of battles, cried aloud, "O God of our fathers, help us! O God, deliver us!" That cry was heard by the attacking host, and especially by one of its captains, Le Noir of Mondovi, or the Black Mondovi. A proud, bigoted, bloodthirsty man, he instantly shouted out that his soldiers would give the answer, accompanying his threat with horrible blasphemies. The Black Mondovi raised his visor as he spoke. At the instant, an arrow from the bow of Pierre Revel of Angrogna entered between his eyes, transfixed his skull, and he fell on the earth a corpse. The fall of this daring leader disheartened the papal army. The soldiers began to fall back. They were chased down the slopes by the Vaudois, who now descended upon them like one of their own mountain torrents, having driven their invaders to the plain, cutting off not a few in their flight. They returned, as the evening began to fall, to celebrate with songs, on the heights where they had won it, the victory with which it had pleased the God of their fathers to crown their arms. Cataneo burned with rage and shame at being defeated by these herdsmen. In a few days, resembling his host, he made a second attempt to enter the Angrogna. This promised to be successful. He passed the height of the Roccomanot, where he had encountered his first defeat, without meeting any resistance. He led his soldiers into the narrow defiles beyond. Here great rocks overhang the path. Mighty chestnut trees fling their branches across the way, veiling it in gloom, and far down thunders the torrent that waters the valley. Still advancing, he found himself, without fighting, in possession of the ample and fruitful expanse into which these defiles passed. The valley opens. He was now master, so far, of the Val d'Angrogna, comprehending the numerous hamlets, with their finely cultivated fields and vineyards, on the left of the torrent. But he had seen none of the inhabitants. These, he knew, were with the men of Lucerna in the Pra del Tor. Between him and his prey rose the barricade, a steep, unscalable mountain, which runs like a wall across the valley, and forms a rampart to the famous meadow, which combines the solemnity of sanctuary with the strength of a citadel. Must the advance of the papal legate and his army end here? It seemed as if it must. Cataneo was in a vast cul-de-sac. He could see the white peaks round the Pra, but between him and the Pra itself rose, in cyclopean strength and height, the barricade. He searched, and unhappily for himself, found an entrance. Some convulsion of nature has here rent the mountains, and through the long, narrow, and dark chasm thus formed lies the one and only path that leads to the head of Angrogna. The leader of the papal host boldly ordered his men to enter and traverse this frightful gorge, not knowing how few of them he should ever lead back. The only pathway through this chasm is a rocky ledge on the side of the mountain, so narrow that not more than two abreast can advance along it. If assailed, either in front or in rear, or from above, there is absolutely no retreat. Nor is there room for the party attacked to fight. The pathway is hung midway between the bottom of the gorge, along which rolls the stream, and the summit of the mountain. Here the naked cliff runs sheer up for at least 1,000 feet. There it leans over the path in stupendous masses, which looks as if about to fall. Here lateral fissures admit the golden beams of the sun, which relieve the darkness of the path and make it visible. There a half-acre or so of level space gives standing room on the mountain side to a clump of birches, with their tall, silvery trunks, or a chalet with its bit of bright, close-shaven meadow. But these only partially relieve the terrors of the chasm, which runs on from 1 to 2 miles, when, with a burst of light, and a sudden flashing of white peaks on the eye, it opens into an amphitheater of meadow of dimensions so goodly that an entire nation might find room to encamp in it. It was into this terrible defile that the soldiers of the papal legate now marched. They kept advancing, as best they could, along the narrow ledge. They were now nearing the proa. It seemed impossible for their prey to escape them. Assembled on this spot, the Waldensian people had but one neck, and the papal soldiers, so Cat Nail believed, were to sever that neck at a blow. But God was watching over the Vaudois. He had said of the papal legate and his army, as of another tyrant of former days, "I will put my hook in thy nose, and my bridle upon thy lips, and I will cause thee to return by the way by which thou earnest." But by what agency was the advance of that host to be stayed? Will some mighty angel smite Cat Nail's army, as he did Sennacherib's? No angel blocked the pass. Will thunderbolts and hailstones be rained upon Cat Nail's soldier, as of old on Sisera's? The thunder slept, the hail fell not. Will earthquake and whirlwind discomfit them? No earthquake rocked the ground, nor whirlwinds rent the mountains. The instrumentality now put in motion to shield the Vaudois from destruction was one of the lightest and frailest of all nature, yet no bars of adamant could have more effectually shut the pass, and brought the march of the host to an instant halt. A white cloud, no bigger than a man's hand, unobserved by the Piedmont, but keenly watched by the Vaudois, was seen to gather on the mountain's summit, about the time the army would be entering the defile. That cloud grew rapidly bigger and blacker. It began to descend. It came rolling down the mountainside, wave on wave, like an ocean tumbling out of heaven. A sea of murky vapor. It fell right into the chasm where the papal army was, sealing it up, and filling it from top to bottom with a thick black fog. In a moment, the hosts were in night. They were bewildered, stupefied, and could see neither before nor behind, could neither advance nor retreat. They halted in a state bordering on terror. The Waldenses interpreted this as an interposition of Providence in their behalf. It had given them the power of repelling the invader. Climbing the slopes of the proa and issuing from all their hiding places in its environs, they spread themselves over the mountains, the paths of which were familiar to them, and while the host stood riveted beneath them, caught in the double toils of the defile and the mist, they tore up the great stones and rocks and sent them thundering down into the ravine. The papal soldiers were crushed where they had stood. Nor was this all. Some of the Waldenses boldly entered the chasm, sword in hand, and attacked them in the front. Consternation seized the Piedmont host. Panic impelled them to flee, but their effort to escape was more fatal than the sword of the Vaudois, or the rocks that, swift as arrow, came bounding down the mountain. They jostled one another. They threw each other down in the struggle. Some were trodden to death. Others toppled over the precipice and expelled on the rocks below, or drowned in the torrent, and so perished miserably. The fate of one of these invaders has been preserved in story. He was a certain Captain Saquet, a man, it is said, of gigantic stature, from Palangara in Piedmont. He began, like his Philistine prototype, to vent curses on the Waldensian dogs. The words were yet in his mouth when his foot slipped, rolling over the precipice, and tumbling into the torrent of the Angrogna. He was carried away by the stream, and his body finally deposited in a deep eddy or whirlpool, called in the patois of the country a tompi, from the noise made by the waters. It bears to this day the name of the Tompi of Saquet, or Gulf of Saket. This war hung above the valleys like a cloud of tempest for a whole year. It inflicted much suffering and loss upon the Waldenses. Their homes were burned, their fields devastated, their goods carried off, and their persons slain. But the invaders suffered greatly more than they inflicted. Of the 18,000 regular troops, to which we may add about an equal number of desperadoes, with which the campaign opened, fewer ever returned to their homes. They left their bones on the mountains they had come to subdue. They were cut off mostly in detail. They were led weary chases from valleys to mountains and from mountains to valley. The rocks rolled down upon them gave them at once death and burial. They were met in narrow defiles and cut to pieces. Flying parties of Waldenses would suddenly issue from the mist, or from some cave known only to themselves, attack and discomfit the foe, and then as suddenly retreat to the friendly vapor or the sheltering rock. Thus it came to pass that, in the words of Muston, this army of invaders vanished from the Vaudois mountains as rain in the sands of the desert. God, says Ledger, turned the heart of their prince toward this poor people. He sent a prelate to their valleys to assure them of his good will, and to intimate his wish to receive their deputies. They sent 12 of their more venerable men to Turin, who, being admitted into the duke's presence, gave him such an account of her faith that he candidly confessed that he had been misled in what he had once done against them, and would not again suffer such wrongs to be inflicted upon them. He several times said that he had not so virtuous, so faithful, and so obedient subjects as the Vaudois. He caused the deputies a little surprise by expressing a wish to see some of the Vaudois children. 12 infants with their mothers were straightway sent for from the valley of Angrogna and presented before the prince. He examined them narrowly. He found them well formed, and testified his admiration of their healthy faces, clear eyes, and lively prattle. He had been told, he said, that the Vaudois children were monsters, with only one eye placed in the middle of their forehead, 4 rows of black teeth, and other similar deformities. He expressed himself as not a little angry at having been made to believe such fables. The prince, Charles II, a youth of only 20 years, but humane and wise, confirmed the privileges and immunities of the Vaudois, and dismissed them with his promise that they should be unmolested in the future. The churches of the valleys now enjoyed a short respite from persecution.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on satellite, internet, or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
The History of Protestantism by James A. Wylie. Volume 2, Book 16, Protestantism in the Waldensian Valleys. Chapter 4, Synod in the Waldensian Valleys. The Duke of Savoy was sincere in his promise that the Vaudois should not be disturbed, but fully to make it good was not altogether in his power. He could take care that such armies of crusaders as that which mustered under the standard of Cataneo should not invade their valleys, but he could not guard them from the secret machinations of the priesthood. In the absence of the armed crusader, the missionary and the inquisitor assailed them. Some were seduced, others were kidnapped and carried off to the Holy Office. To these annoyances was added the yet greater evil of a decaying piety. A desire for repose made many conform outwardly to the Romish Church, in order to be shielded from all interruption in their journeys on business. They obtained from the priests, who were settled in the valleys, certificates or testimonials of their being papist. To obtain this credential, it was necessary to attend the Roman chapel, to confess, to go to Mass, and to have their children baptized by the priests. For this shameful and criminal dissimulation, they fancied that they made amends by muttering to themselves when they entered the Romish temples, "Cave of robbers, may God confound thee." At the same time, they continued to attend the preaching of the Vaudois pastors and to submit themselves to their censures. But beyond all question, the men who practiced these deceits, and the church that tolerated them, had greatly declined. That old vine seemed to be dying. A little while it would disappear from off those mountains which it had so long covered with the shadow of its boughs. But he who had planted it looked down from heaven and visited it. It was now that the Reformation broke out. The river of the water of life was opened a second time, and began to flow through Christendom. The old and dying stock in the Alps, drinking of the celestial stream, lived anew. Its boughs began to be covered with blossoms and fruit as of old. The Reformation had begun its career, and had already stirred most of the countries of Europe to their depths before tidings of the mighty change reached these secluded mountains. When at last the great news was announced, the Vaudois were as men who dreamed, eager to have them confirmed and to know to what extent the yoke of Rome had been cast off by the nations of Europe. They sent forth Pastor Martin of the valley of Lucerna on a mission of inquiry. In 1526, he returned with the amazing intelligence that the light of the old Evangel had broken on Germany, on Switzerland, on France, and that every day was adding to the number of those who openly professed the same doctrines to which the Vaudois had borne witness from ancient times. To attest what he said, he produced the books that he had received in Germany, containing the views of the Reformers. The remnant of the Vaudois on the north of the Alps also sent men out to collect information respecting that great spiritual revolution which had so surprised and gladdened them. In 1530, the churches of Provence and Dauphine commissioned George Morel of Merindol and Pierre Masson of Burgundy to visit the reformers of Switzerland and Germany, and bring them word touching their doctrine and manner of life. The deputies met in conference with the members of the Protestant churches of Neuchâtel, Moray, and Bern. They had also interviews with Berthold Haller and William Farel. Going on to Basel, they presented to Johannes Ecolampadius, in October 1530, a document in Latin containing a complete account of their ecclesiastical discipline, worship, doctrine, and manners. They begged in return that Ecolampadius would say whether he approved of the order and doctrine of their church, and if he held it to be defective, to specify in what points and to what extent the elder church submitted itself to the younger. The visit of these two pastors of this ancient church gave unspeakable joy to the reformer of Basel. He heard in them the voice of the church primitive and apostolic, speaking to the Christians of the 16th century, and bidding them welcome within the gates of the city of God. What a miracle was before him! For ages had this church been in the fires, yet she had not been consumed. Was not this encouragement to those who were just entering into persecutions not less terrible? We render thanks, said Johannes in his letter, October 13th, 1530, to the churches of Provence, to our most gracious Father, that he has called you into such marvelous light during ages in which thick darkness has covered almost the whole world under the empire of Antichrist. We love you as brethren. But his affection for them did not blind him to their declensions, nor make him withhold those admonitions which he saw to be needed. As we approve of many things amongst you, he wrote, so there are several which we wish to see amended. We are informed that the fear of persecution has caused you to dissemble and to conceal your faith. There is no concord between Christ and Belial. You commune with unbelievers. You take part in their abominable masses, in which the death and passion of Christ are blasphemed. I know your weakness, but it becomes those who have been redeemed by the blood of Christ to be more courageous. It is better for us to die than to be overcome by temptation. It was thus that Johannes, speaking in the name of the Church of the Reformation, repaid the Church of the Alps for the services she had rendered to the world in former ages. By sharp, faithful brotherly rebuke, he sought to restore her to purity and glory which she had lost. Having finished with Ecolampadius, the deputies went on to Strasbourg. There they had interviews with Bucer and Capito. A similar statement of their faith to the reformers of that city drew forth similar congratulations and counsels. In the clear light of her morning, the Reformation saw many things which had grown dim in the evening of the Vaudois Church, and the Reformers willingly permitted their elder sister the benefit of their own wider views. If the men of the 16th century recognized the voice of primitive Christianity speaking in the Vaudois, the latter heard the voice of the Bible, or rather of God himself, speaking in the Reformers, and submitted themselves with modesty and meekness to their reproofs. The last had become first. A manifold interest belongs to the meeting of these two churches. Each is a miracle to the other. The preservation of the Vaudois Church for so many ages, amid the fires of persecution, made her a wonder to the Church of the 16th century. The bringing up of the latter from the dead made her a yet greater wonder to the Church of the 1st century. These two churches compare their respective beliefs. They find that their creeds are not twain, but one. They compare the sources of their knowledge. They find that they have both of them drawn their doctrine from the Word of God. They are not two churches, they are one. They are the elder and the younger members of the same glorious family, the children of the same Father. What a magnificent monument of the true antiquity and genuine Catholicity of Protestantism. Only one of the two province deputies returned from their visit to the reformers of Switzerland. On their way back, at Dijon, suspicion, from some cause or other, fell on Pierre Masson. He was thrown into prison and ultimately condemned and burned. His fellow deputy was allowed to go on his way. George Morel, bearing the answers of the reformers, and especially the letters of Ecolampadius, happily arrived in safety in Provence. The documents he brought with him were much canvassed. Their contents caused the two ancient churches mingled joy and sorrow, the former, however, greatly predominating. The news touching the numerous body of Christians now appearing in many lands, so full of knowledge and faith and courage, was literally astounding. The confessors of the Alps thought that they were alone in the world. Every successive century saw their numbers thinning, and their spirit growing less resolute. Their ancient enemy, on the other hand, was steadfastly widening her dominion and strengthening her sway. A little longer, they imagined, and all public, faithful profession of the gospel would cease. It was at that moment they were told that a new army of champions had arisen to maintain the old battle. This announcement explained and justified the past to them, for now they beheld the fruit of their father's blood. They who had fought the battle were not to have the honor of the victory. That was reserved for combatants who had come newly into the field. They had forfeited this reward they painfully felt by their defections, hence the regret that mingled with their joy. They proceeded to discuss the answers that should be made to the churches of the Protestant faith, considering especially whether they should adopt the reforms urged upon them in the communications which their deputies had brought back from the Swiss and German reformers. The great majority of the Vaudois barbs were of opinion that they ought. A small minority, however, were opposed to this because they thought that it did not become new disciples to dictate to the old, or because they themselves were secretly inclined to the Roman superstitions. They went back again to the reformers for advice, and after repeated interchange of views, it was finally resolved to convene a synod in the valleys, at which all the questions between the two churches might be debated, and the relations which they were to sustain toward each other in time to come determined. If the Church of the Alps was to continue apart as before the Reformation, she felt that she must justify her position by proving the existence of great and substantial differences in doctrine between herself and the newly risen church. But if no such differences existed, she would not and dared not remain separate and alone. She must unite with the Church of the Reformation. It was resolved that the coming synod should be a truly ecumenical one, a general assembly of all the children of the Protestant faith. A hearty invitation was sent forth, and it was cordially and generally responded to. All the Waldensian churches in the bosom of the Alps were represented in this synod. The Albigensian communities on the north of the chain and the Vaudois churches in Calabria sent deputies to it. The churches of French Switzerland chose William Farel and Anthony Saunier to attend it. Even from more distant lands, as Bohemia, came men to deliberate and vote in this famous convention. The representatives assembled on the 12th of October, 1532. 2 years earlier, the Augsburg Confession had been given to the world, marking the culmination of the German Reformation. A year before, Zwingli had died on the field of Cappel. In France, the Reformation was beginning to shine by the heroic deaths of its children. Calvin had not taken his prominent place at Geneva, but he was already enrolled under the Protestant banner. The princes of the Smalcald League were standing at bay in the presence of Charles V. It was a critical yet glorious era in the annals of Protestantism which saw this assembly convened. It met at the town of Chamferans, in the heart of the valley of Angrogna. There are few grander or stronger positions in all that valley than the site occupied by this little town. The approach to which it was defended by the heights of the Rocomano and La Serre, and by defiles which now contract, now widen, but are everywhere overhung by great rocks and mighty chestnut trees, behind and above which rise the taller peaks, some of them snow-clad. A little beyond La Serre is the plateau on which the town stood, overlooking the grassy bosom of the valley, which is watered by a crystal torrent, dotted by numerous chalets, and runs on for about 2 miles, till shut in by the steep, naked precipice of the barricade, which, stretching from side to side of Angrogna, leaves only the long, dark chasm we have already described as the pathway to the Pra del Tor, whose majestic mountains here rise on the site and suggest to the traveler the idea that he is drawing nigh some city of celestial magnificence. The town of Chamferans does not now exist. Its only representative at this day is a solitary farmhouse. The synod sat for 6 consecutive days. All the points raised in the communications received from the Protestant churches were freely ventilated by the assembled barbs and elders. Their findings were embodied in a short confession of faith, which Monaster says may be considered as a supplement to the ancient confession of faith of the year 1120, which it does not contradict in any point. It consists of 17 articles, the chief of which are the moral inability of man, election to eternal life, the will of God, as made known in the Bible, the only rule of duty, and the doctrine of the 2 sacraments only, baptism and the Lord's Supper. The lamp, which had been on the point of expiring, began, after this synod, to burn with its former brightness. The ancient spirit of the Waldenses revived. They no longer practiced those dissimulations and cowardly concealments to which they previously had recourse to avoid persecution. They no longer feared to confess their faith. Henceforward, they were never seen at Mass or in the popish churches. They refused to recognize the priests of Rome as ministers of Christ, and under no circumstance would they receive any spiritual benefit or service at their hands. Another sign of the new life that now animated the Vaudois was their setting about the work of rebuilding their churches. For 50 years previous, public worship may be said to have ceased in their valleys. Their churches had been razed by the persecutor, and the Vaudois feared to rebuild them lest they should draw down upon themselves a new storm of violence and blood. A cave would serve at times as a place of meeting. In more peaceful years, the house of their barb, or some of their chief men, would be converted into a church, and when the weather was fine, they would assemble on the mountainside under the great boughs of their ancestral trees. But their old sanctuaries they dared not raise from the ruins into which the persecutor had cast them. They might say with the ancient Jews, "The holy and beautiful house in which our fathers praised thee is burned with fire, and all our pleasant things are laid waste." But now, strengthened by the fellowship and counsels of their Protestant brethren, churches arose, and the worship of God was reinstituted. Hard by the place where the synod stood, at Lorenzo, namely, was the first of these post-Reformation churches set up. Others speedily followed in the other valleys. Pastors were multiplied, crowds flocked to their preaching, and not a few came from the plains of Piedmont and remote parts of their valleys to drink of these living waters again flowing in their land. Yet another token did this old church give to the vigorous life that was now flowing in her veins. This was a translation of the Scriptures into the French tongue. At the Synod, the resolution was taken to translate and print both the Old and New Testaments, and as this was to be done at the sole charge of the Vaudois, it was considered as their gift to the churches of the Reformation, a most appropriate and noble gift. That book which the Waldenses had received from the primitive church, which their fathers had preserved with their blood, which their barbs had laboriously transcribed and circulated, they now put into the hands of the reformers, constituting them along with themselves the custodians of this ark of the world's hope. Robert Olivetan, a near relative of Calvin, was asked to undertake the translation, and he executed it, it is believed, with the help of his great kinsman. It was printed in folio, in black letter at Neuchâtel, in the year 1535, by Pierre de Wingle, commonly called Picard. The entire expense was defrayed by the Waldenses, who collected for this object 1,500 crowns of gold, a large sum for so poor a people. Thus did the Waldensian Church emphatically proclaim, at the commencement of this new era, that the Word of God was her sole foundation. As has been already mentioned, a commission to attend the Synod had been given by the churches of French Switzerland to Farel and Saunier. Its fulfillment necessarily involved great toil and peril. One crosses the Alps at this day so easily that it is difficult to conceive the toil and danger that attended the journey then. The deputies could not take the ordinary tracks across the mountains. For fear of pursuit, they were compelled to travel by unfrequented paths. The way often led by the edge of precipice and abyss, up steep and dangerous ascents, and across fields of frozen snow. Nor were their pursuers the only dangers they had to fear. They were exposed to death from the blinding drifts and tempests of the hills. Nevertheless, they arrived in safety in the valleys, and added by their presence and their counsels to the dignity of this, the first great ecclesiastical assembly of modern times. Of this we have a somewhat remarkable proof. 3 years thereafter, a Vaudois, Jean Pirel of Angrogna, being cast into prison, deposed on his trial that he had kept guard for the ministers who taught the good law, who were assembled in the town of Chanfarans, in the center of Angrogna, and that amongst others present there was one called Farrell, who had a red beard, and a beautiful white horse, and 2 others accompanied him, one of whom had a horse almost black, and the other was very tall and rather lame.